Today we will follow Ilya from Klubny Servis Moscow yet again as they disassemble GWM Tank 300 fully and highlight a lot of interesting things to us potential owners of Tank 300 in Australia when the car finally becomes available on our shores, which should happen very soon. Translation and adaptation of the original video for English-speaking audience was made by me, Dmitry of Value Cars Australia. All rights to the original content belong to Klubny Servis Channel, and the source video link is provided in the description of this video with my thanks to the original authors. Please always keep in mind that my channel has no political affiliation and I do not tolerate any racist or political statements in the comments to my videos, as all we discuss here are cars, that's it. Any political statements get deleted immediately and their authors get banned without any warning or hesitation. So please do not violate the community guidelines of my channel. Thank you. To start this disassembly and assessment of the overall value of Tank 300, let's start with the rough price comparison. A GWM Tank 300 currently costs an extortionist price of 75 to 80,000 Australian dollars equivalent on the territory of Russia, only about 46,000 in China where it's made, and aims to hit the market here in Australia for about 55 to 60,000 dollars, which is not cheap but bearable when we look at how much bare bones Toyota Prado would cost you these days. We've already followed Ilya's overall initial impressions of the car in another video that you're most welcome to watch first if you missed it, and pluses are, to recap, are rather good handling for a vehicle of this kind, reasonable dynamics on the road, obviously a bit slow acceleration as it's not a race car and the engine specifications are kind of not in that ballpark, and the aerodynamics are very cube-like. Minuses: technically, mechanically, some parts are made for, according to Ilya, for one use only kind of stuff. Usually the plastic clips, the plastic kind of fittings of certain things. If you, for example, wanted your mechanic to remove the radiator for service, or let's say replacement in case you had a frontal collision, it would be very problematic apparently. Next, we will take a look at mechanical and structural elements of the cars. That's why you're watching a disassembly video, don't you? To get an idea of what it's made of and how it's put together. So, engine, 220 horsepower in this particular model in review, 4-cylinder turbo petrol engine. The battery is being used of Varta technology, which is China-made particularly unit, but it apparently all sort of points out at a relatively good but kind of mainstream technological level when you see some of the elements that are good, solid, kind of industry standard within this price range, but then you see something that kind of raises eyebrows a little bit and looks like cheaper elements, such as these bolted on rather awkward kind of holders over there. So these it's sort of a bit of a mixed bag according to Ilya over here. If we move on and take a look at the structural kind of particulars of these fenders, how the fenders of the car are put together, if you were unlucky enough to have a side collision, side hit, you would need to potentially pay to replace this plastic support of the fender underneath as well as the outer shell. This shows the philosophy of the company, as ultimately the more parts that one would need to order in order to do a replacement in case of collision or some form of repair, the more money the company gets paid, which we can't kind of criticize them for, but this is just something to take note of. As far as the interior of the vehicle is concerned, it is a vehicle on a true hard frame like a real four-wheel drive truck is made classically, and Ilya says it with positive kind of mention here. Reinforcement of this frame appears to be rather slim and kinda a tiny bit flimsy in places, but then the thresholds, let's say the perimeter of the frame, are rather solid to protect you and the vehicle from the side collision. There are lots of airbags pre-installed. Nuances are always, though, in detail of how the manufacturer went about fitting those things, where you can see Ilya is pointing out this little element, kind of rather flimsy, not very reliably attached element to hold the plastic of the interior of the car, and it does look like an afterthought addition of those kind of little hoops rather than something that would have been a part of a properly thought through and solid structural design. The passive defense of the car, so to speak, we have two reinforcement elements in the front doors. They are rather small, but obviously Chinese manufacturer thinks that it would be fine, it would be sufficient, and the results of the crash tests that are available for Tank 300 on the internet right now are actually rather promising. Once again, looking at the structural particulars of Tank 300 from mechanical and service center perspective that Ilya mostly maintains in his videos, he points out that the way GWM Tank decided to fit the rear bumper is with a noticeable gap in between the body of the vehicle and the bumper itself, not flush, so to speak, with the body. But from the maintenance and repair of the vehicle perspective, that this kind of vehicle could be beaten up a little bit during its off-road trips or some sort of other collisions, smaller collisions, including with the terrain. The basic structural construction is actually probably better than some of the more modern units that are there on the market right now. The problem of all classic four-wheel drives was over the years is that any damage caused if the car rolled during a crash or extreme off-road adventures, the damage caused kind of to the body of the car. Here the Chinese manufacturer went with a rather classic and proven approach, introducing these four very solid rear pillars. If we were to compare those, for example, to Toyota Prado apparently doesn't have that kind of structure, and the rear pillars are a lot thinner and softer. The floor is a single structural element without any particular callouts that Ilya would have made about it, so it seems okay. As far as the roof is concerned of the vehicle, Ilya likes these 5 or so reinforcement ribs, as he refers to them, and those, according to him, would add structural integrity and robustness to the whole box in case of heavy snowfalls. God knows what kind of heavy snowfalls those need to be. I know we don't care about those in Australia, but perhaps if a kangaroo decides to leap and land on your roof, have you seen how massive those things are? That's when you'll remember this video segment and let out a sigh of relief. Electricals apparently are done very well in this car, according to Ilya. Fittings are plastic, yeah, not super reliable, but how it's all tied together, how all the wiring is done, is actually very, very good, and reminds Ilya of Haval H9. That was very, very popular on the territory of Russia because it's much cheaper than Prado, but it's very, very good replica of Prado. So Ilya thinks that your mechanic or service center might need to do something about revisiting this wiring, maybe after 5 to 6 years of you driving the car around, which would be a very healthy time interval, and it would likely be much longer in our much milder conditions, other than we think about the dust and the heat perhaps, so your mileage will vary obviously, but it's definitely not Russian weather conditions. When Chinese manufacturer wants to fit anything on a frame, according to Ilya, they basically drill a hole and put a metal piece through it, and fit it with a bolt, which is very, very basic, somewhat questionable, but time-proven method. And as far as welding of the pieces together is concerned, Ilya says that he likes it overall, it's done rather well. There is only one element here that he's pointing out with 3 little welding spots that are a bit surprising, but overall he's quite happy with what he saw here. As always, he criticizes factory sound insulation, that it's almost non-existent, which is probably true, but also let's keep in mind that his service center in Moscow sells sound insulation as part of aftermarket kind of services, and the road conditions there are much worse in Russia than in Australia, which makes the extra sound insulation probably a necessity. For us in urban Australia at the very least, all of this is more or less beside the point, but let's take a note of it. If you test drive the car even without this extra sound insulation, though, he points out, you would actually not be too disappointed apparently. And according to Ilya, it is because it is a rather heavy vehicle that is on a solid frame that sits higher from the ground than an average car, and that alone makes the drive much smoother and quieter, even without this extra aftermarket sound insulation. As a little bit kind of cute side note, believe it or not, the floor of the boot of this car can be extracted, removed, and converted into this nice little camping table with foldable legs, which I personally thought was absolutely awesome, even though it looks too low to use it for a picnic with the family if you're using chairs, but if you're sitting on the ground crossing your legs, I suppose, I guess it's sufficient height. Quality of the plastic elements is quickly mentioned here. It's not bendable plastic, probably a nightmare for someone who needs to replace or fix it even after a minor crash, say if it wasn't covered by warranty, but in our cases of 99% chance in Australia everything is covered by warranty, probably not a particular worry. The rest of the interior of the car and the quality of the parts that Ilya is kind of showing to us here very quickly, insulation, floor carpet, lining, all this kind of stuff is rather standard and not too bad from what I understood, and isn't causing any particular negative emotions. Now, looking underneath the car, the first thing that Ilya is demonstrating here to us is that it is absolutely undoubtedly, as already mentioned several times, the car was totally designed for off-road. The radiator of the car is protected by a metal bar here, and then there are massive fittings for the wheels, all these massive levers and arms there connecting things and bolts that he's pointing out. Everything is nice and solid with very strong bolts all around, which Ilya likes and I do too. If you see here under the front axle of the vehicle with these differentials enabling the rotating moment on the front wheels, when it's required, this car, let's remind ourselves that at least this model is not a constant four-wheel drive mode, but it's what's referred to as part-time four-wheel drive mode, where the car can drive using just rear wheels, or then it switches into the all-wheel drive mode. Typical fault of these implementations on part-time off-roaders has been that if you used to accelerate on those older models with slightly differently assembled parts, somewhere on the sand, let's say, one wheel could get a lot of traction while the other one doesn't, which might cause even cracking apparently there in the middle if the material is different. This China-made implementation is great apparently because this whole element that Ilya is pointing out is made of cast iron. Effectively able to handle, as I understood, these kinds of heavy driving conditions and difficulties and pressure better than softer alloys that we see used more and more in the modern off-roader vehicles. All in all, Ilya is pointing out yet again the very solid off-road capable suspension here that relies on classic time-proven design that is very hard to critique. Now, transmission, the main criteria for an off-roader is to make sure that it's reliable and protected as much as possible. None of that dual clutch robotic transmission rubbish. Once again, here Ilya is pointing out that a very, very solid frame and how it's all built, criticizing only the anti-corrosion spray that's been applied, and according to him it's insufficient, but once again, that part is also bread and butter of what Klubny Servis does as aftermarket additions for their customers, which is less applicable to the potential owners of Tank 300 in Australia. Drive shaft is causing no worries or particular questions from Ilya. Everything appears rather standard to his eye, and the petrol tank as well that he's pointing out is protected by a thin layer of steel casing of sorts, which is definitely better than exposed plastic ones. Rear axle is yet another classic implementation, and according to Ilya, the way it's put together contributes to a much smoother and more pleasant drive than Toyota Prado, as he certainly drove both of those vehicles, which I will just have to take his word for at this stage. Disc brakes on the rear wheels are applied over here, which is sort of good to see, and yet again a very selective application of anti-corrosion spray here on the side of the body. And that is all we see. So let's summarize. Ilya really likes the car because it's relatively fast, maneuverable, mechanically put together according to classic Japanese and old European off-roaders. And in case you're new to these videos and in case you haven't watched the first part of his early impressions and his walkthrough of the interior of the car, I do recommend that you watch it, by the way. Ilya is generally not a fan of Chinese cars. He is assembling, disassembling, fixing, doing all sorts of stuff in his Klubny Servis in Moscow, including two China-made cars. But generally, he's rather skeptical and generally he's rather critical. But in this case, he's been praising Tank full on, and I do trust the man. That is filling me with hope. So in Russia, it currently appears among the best, if not the best off-roaders Tank 300 available for half the price of Toyota Prado, apparently. And yet again, Ilya maintains the view that it drives much better. Don't ask me how. We'll need to try for ourselves when the car is available for a test drive in Australia. Of course, I'll be doing one, and of course, I'll be publishing my own review from Value Cars Australia. And also, he says that the interior apparently feels much richer and better than Toyota Prado overall, which I can believe very, very easily, knowing just how bare bones Toyotas are. So what can I say as a wrap up, my friends? Watching this video from Klubny Servis and translating it for you made me really want this car. Yep. No, it's not available in Australia just yet, at least at the moment of recording of this video, and I don't have that kind of loose change lying around either. But hey, it's something to start saving for. Did you like this video? Please don't leave without giving it a like then. Share your own thoughts in the comments down below if you're not too shy, and I promise to respond to everyone who is not a troll. Those get banned with no hesitation lately. Such is life of a small YouTube channel these days. I thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.